We are ready. We are ready. We are ready. Thank you so much. It was a particular delight of mine over lunch to just listen to some other people's conversations and to notice just how, I don't know what the correct adjective or verb, there was a sense of feeling stirred, but different people were stirred by different things. And I really value that because there's a sort of multifacetedness, which I think plays back into what Joel was talking about, how almost like a prism of refracted light, there's all these different flavors, to mix the metaphor, that are coming out today. So I love that. But now we're going to move on with one of the tastiest flavors of all. Oh, I'm so sorry. That was a bad thing to say. I would like to introduce Brian McGreevy to you. So the Reverend Brian McGreevy is assistant to the rector of St. Philip's Anglican Church, Charleston. He's one of our locals here. He's one of our locals. Reverend McGreevy teaches and speaks regularly on C.S. Lewis and the Inklings, and in association with Inklings expert and author Colin Duriez, has led several study tours to the UK, focusing on Lewis, Tolkien, and the Inklings. His podcasts on Lewis's work are followed by thousands of listeners. Go ahead and Google them now. And he served as the co-organizer of the 2023 Mere Anglicanism Conference, which was named Telling a More Beautiful Story, Lessons from C.S. Lewis on Reaching a Fractured World, which was the largest Lewis conference ever held, selling out with over 900 attendees. He's married to the former Jane Hollis Whitney, and they have 4 children and 4 grandchildren. And I'd like you to welcome Brian McGreevy.
Thank you so much, David. I'm delighted to be here. I've told a few people I have about 3 hours worth of material that we're going to try to cover in a very short period of time, so it'll be the bird's eye view with the bird flying really fast. So we're going to be talking about joy in the real world, and one of the things that has come through in a lot of the presentations already today is this idea of hope and joy that is continually springing out of Tolkien, even when things look really dark. And I love this image that's from the movie, because part of what you see is all of these representatives of different races and different backgrounds who've been separated by all sorts of conditions, and they are drawn together in this quest. And I think that is a beautiful metaphor for us today. So we are going to jump right in and talk a little bit about Tolkien's mythopoeic imagination and this whole idea of joy and the bright shadow from another world. We're going to start by framing this with George MacDonald and C.S. Lewis, who obviously are in the same vein of what you might call theologically infused fantasy writing. And one of the things Lewis talks about in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, is this whole idea of the stab of joy, which is reminiscent of Tolkien's idea of eucatastrophe, that joy but poignant as grief. And so they're very much in the same realm here. And Lewis talks about the stab of joy as a bright shadow, a glimpse of beauty from another world that awakened a yearning for that world and an experience of desiring that world. And when he first read George MacDonald's Phantastes as a 16-year-old, picking it up out of a used bookshelf on a platform of the train station, he said, "But now I saw the bright shadow coming out of the book into the real world and resting there, transforming all common things and yet unchanged. Or more accurately, I saw the common things drawn into the bright shadow." And then Lewis, when he's writing an introduction to an anthology of MacDonald, he talks about the fact that reading the kinds of things that MacDonald wrote and that Tolkien wrote, when you read those things, it arouses in us sensations we've never had before never anticipated having, as though we had broken out of our normal mode of consciousness and possessed joys not promised at our birth. It gets under our skin, hits at us at a level deeper than our thoughts or even our passions, troubles oldest certainties till all questions are reopened, and in general shocks us more fully awake than we are for most of our lives. And I think there's a deep truth in there about Tolkien's writing. And one of the things I'm going to play with a little bit in this presentation is, what is the real world? What is the real world? Is the real world the world that we are sitting in, touching these tablecloths and sitting in these chairs and breathing this air? Or is the real world the world that Tolkien is imagining, and that world that is the ultimate kingdom of God? And all of this, I would love to go into a long discourse on Plato and Neoplatonism that we don't have time for, but just to say Plato's theory of forms and the allegory of the cave both kind of give us this idea that there is this other realm, not necessarily what Tolkien would call the perilous realm, but there's this other realm where truth, goodness, beauty, and joy are perfected. And that realm is continually breaking in on us if we will but have eyes to see and ears to hear. So what is real life? What is the real world? And I love this little passage that is from On Fairy Stories, which we've already heard referenced today, which started as the Andrew Lang Lectures in 1839 before it was published. And Tolkien said this: "Not long ago, incredible though it may seem, I heard a clerk of Oxenford declare that he welcomed the proximity of mass production robot factories and the roar of self-obstructive mechanical traffic, because it brought his university into contact with real life. He may have meant that the way men were living and working in the 20th century was increasing in barbarity at an alarming rate, and that the loud demonstration of this in the streets of Oxford might serve as a warning that it's not possible to preserve for long an oasis of sanity in a desert of unreason by mere fences without actual offensive action. I fear he did not. In any case, the expression real life in this context seems to fall short of academic standards. The notion that motor cars are more alive than, say, centaurs or dragons is curious. That they are more real than, say, horses is pathetically absurd. How real, how startlingly alive is a factory chimney compared with an elm tree? Poor, obsolete thing. Insubstantial dream of an escapist." Tolkien's not mincing words here. And then he goes on to say, "The joy that I've selected as the mark of the true fairy story merits more consideration." And this whole thing that we already read about being a real maker, and the real maker hopes that in his subcreation, the secondary world is mirroring reality or flowing into it. And if he achieves that, the work partakes of reality. And he says that the peculiar quality of joy and successful fantasy can be explained as a sudden glimpse of the underlying reality or truth. It is not only a consolation for the sorrow of this world, but a satisfaction and an answer to that question, is it true? i.e., what we see about joy and what we see in these stories, even though we think it's fantasy, it's true with a capital T. And this is the same sort of dialogue about what is real life that you see in Lewis's The Screwtape Letters. And just as an aside, that is a picture of the reading room at the British Museum where The Screwtape Letters is set, the opening scene. It's been closed for years and it's just been reopened. If you're in London, please go. It's fabulous. But Lewis starts off The Screwtape Letters with this patient trying to be tempted by Screwtape and the demons, and suddenly the patient sitting reading starts thinking great thoughts, and the demon gets really alarmed, and he says the best cure to deal with this is to make him think he needs to worry about his lunch, and then he sends him outside, and he needs to be exposed to real life. He says, once I got him in the street, The battle was won. I showed him a newsboy shouting the midday paper, a number 73 bus, and we reached the bottom of the steps. I'd got into him an unalterable conviction that whatever odd ideas might come into a man's head when he was shut up alone with his books, a healthy dose of real life, by which he meant the bus and the newsboy, was enough to show him that all that sort of thing just couldn't be true. So, right in line with this whole idea of real life or real life, and then Tolkien probably was not a huge fan of Puritan writers for the most part, but this quotation from John Flavel is so on point. All that delights you in earthly things can never satisfy you, for all your desires are in God. The comforts you have here are only drops inflaming, not satisfying the appetites of your soul, but the Lamb will lead you to fountains of living water. So we're going to do a quick tour through some of Tolkien's works, looking at the evolution of this idea of joy as it shows up in different places. So we're first going to look at Mythopoeia. We're going to look at a little bit at Beowulf, his address to the British Academy, and his essay, The Monsters and the Critics, a little bit at The Hobbit, a little bit on fairy stories, and a little bit at The Lord of the Rings, going really fast. So Mythopoeia is this wonderful poem that Tolkien wrote recounting the conversation that he had on Addison's Walk on September 19th, 1931, with Hugo Dyson and C.S. Lewis. And this conversation, which has been referenced earlier, is what led to Lewis's profound conversion to the Christian faith. And this poem is fire. If you have never read this poem, the reason I put the whole thing into this presentation, much as I would love to read all of it, there's not time, but it's all in there. So when you go back, please read the whole poem and read it out loud, even if you're by yourself and people think you're crazy. It is just so great. But part of what is happening is this dialogue between these two worldviews, the materialist, atheistic worldview and this worldview that is full of joy, that embraces what Jared Manley Hopkins talks about in his poem, God's Grandeur, where he says, the world is charged with the glory of God. It will flame out like shook foil. And Tolkien loved Hopkins' poetry. And Tolkien had that enchanted view of reality, that joy was baked into creation, it was baked into existence, even in the face of lots of evidence to the contrary, if you would only look for it. And so I'm just going to look a little bit at this stanza that's up on the top of the second column there. And Lewis has talked about the fact that we walk on the earth and tread with solemn pace one of the many minor globes of space. A star is a star, matter in a ball, compelled to courses mathematical, amid the regimented cold inane where destined atoms are each moment slain. It's a materialist view, but the top of the second column is Tolkien. He sees no stars who does not see them first, of living silver made, that sudden burst to flame like flowers beneath an ancient song, whose very echo after music long has since pursued. There is no firmament, only a void, unless a jeweled tent, myth woven and elf patterned, and no earth unless the mother's womb, whence all have birth. And there's all of this just beautiful language here about what it means to be a sub-creator, that to be a sub-creator is to be fully in the image of God, and that as you do that, you are able to create joy and draw people into it. And then there's this great echoing of the Beatitudes form, and we already heard a little bit of this, but I'm going to reread some of it. Blessed are the timid hearts that evil hate, that quail in its shadow, and yet shut the gate, that seek no parley, and in guarded room, though small and bare upon a clumsy loom, weave tissues gilded by the far-off day, hoped and believed in under shadow's sway. Even though everything is wrong, they're under the oppression of evil, they're having to hide in their guarded room. They're still weaving banners for the day that one day good is going to triumph and that they are going to be freed from the shadow's sway. And then the top of that next column, I would that I might with the minstrels sing and stir the unseen with a throbbing string. I would be with the mariners of the deep that cut their slender planks on mountains steep and voyage upon a vague and wandering quest, for some have passed beyond the fabled west. And it's this whole idea of singing in that hall, that mead hall that pervades all of Tolkien's works, where there's that warm fire and there's fellowship and there's music and there's truth, beauty, and goodness that are being celebrated. Oh, I wish I could read this whole thing, but we're not going to. All right, I commend it to you. So, Beowulf. You cannot understand Tolkien without understanding Beowulf. And if you didn't have the privilege of getting to study Beowulf when you were in school, I would commend to you to go back. Tolkien's translation, which is sort of in some ways the case study of Leaf by Niggle, where he started this translation back in the 1930s and it didn't get finished until his death. He just couldn't stop messing with it. But it is replete with commentary, and it's just so good. So Beowulf was in danger of being lost to culture, along with Paradise Lost and some other things, until Tolkien and Lewis took on the Oxford English faculty and changed the syllabus and brought it back. And Beowulf was really understood mostly philologically, looking at sort of the development of language and the move from Anglo-Saxon to Old English and Middle English, all of those kinds of things. But Tolkien was invited to address at the British Academy in 1936, and this address revolutionized the study of Beowulf. His lectures on Beowulf at Oxford attracted other scholars, and he talked about the fact that Beowulf was a work of art, not just a historical document, and that there were things to be appreciated in the story, and that the monsters, which people complained about because they were not human foes, the monsters, Grendel, Grendel's mother, and the dragon, are integral to the story, and the focus is man at war with the hostile world and his inevitable overthrow in time. But Tolkien really landed hard on the fact that there are echoes of the Christian God and the Christian story all through Beowulf, so that it is not like an epic that ends totally in despair. Northern Courage, which I'm going to skip because we have that coming later, is features in this. And so the idea here for Tolkien is that the Christian is hemmed in a hostile world. The monsters are evil spirits, but the monsters remain real. The focus remains an ancient theme that man, each man, and all men, and all their work shall die, but there is still hope. And one of the beautiful things is Tolkien uses allegory about how they got so focused, all of the critics and the studiers of Beowulf, looking at the mechanics of Beowulf, that they missed the point. And he uses this allegory that I'm just going to read about the destruction of beauty. And he said these scholars missed the whole point of the poem. And he said it was like this: a man inherited a field in which was an accumulation of old stone, part of an older hall. There's the hall again. Of the old stones, some had already been used in building the house where he lived, not far from the old house of his fathers. Of the rest, he took some and built a tower. But his friends coming perceived at once, without troubling to climb the steps, that these stones formerly belonged to a more ancient building. So they pushed the tower over with no little labor, and in order to look for hidden carvings and inscriptions, or discover what the man's distant forefathers had obtained their building material, some, suspecting a deposit of coal under the soil, began to dig for it and forgot the stone. So they all said, "This tower is most interesting." But they also said, after pushing it over, "What a muddle it is in." And even the man's own descendants, who might have been expected to consider what he'd been about, were heard to murmur, "He's such an odd fellow." Imagine using those old stones just to build a nonsensical tower. Why did he not restore the old house? He had no sense of proportion. But from the top of that tower, the man had been able to look out upon the sea. That was the whole point of the tower, to be able to see the beauty and experience the joy of the sea. And that whole idea is permeating Tolkien's work about joy, that the point of so many things in life is for the joy that we were created for, but we get focused on the rubble rather than on those things. And I'm not going to read this excerpt, but in the Beowulf poem, part of what sets the monster off is he can't stand the joy that's going on in the mead hall, and he wants to destroy it. And that joy is coming from the Scot, the bard, talking about how the Almighty made the earth a shining bright plain, surrounded by waters. He established the sun and the moon, victorious and triumphant, the lamps of light for those living on land, and ornamented all the corners of the earth with limbs and leaves. He also shaped life itself and all kinds of creatures which quickly scurry about. That joy is directly related to the creation biblical narrative. So, moving on to The Hobbit. Whoops. All right, David, you're going to have to come back. So I'm losing it after that slide.
Let's see what's happened. I'll come back. I'm so sorry, Brian.
That's quite all right.
Let's see if we just pull up yours on its own, if we get anywhere. Where's the last one here? Yeah, so. Where are we to define the world of the
Yep,
Hobbit?
there we are, right there. All right,
Let's just go
perfect.
from here.
All right, got it. So The Hobbit, 1937, Lewis and Tolkien have been talking about the kind of works they want to write. The Hobbit gets written, and one of the things that happens is that it is sort of against all odds published. And one of the things that really made it take off was Lewis wrote a review of The Hobbit for the London Times. And one of the things Lewis says in this review is that part of what is remarkable about this book, The Hobbit, is that it admits us to a world of its own, a world that seems to have been going on long before we stumbled into it, but which, once found by the right reader, becomes indispensable to him, the way that that world has become indispensable to many of us. And part of what Lewis does in this review is he goes on this wonderful exploration of why this world is so meaningful. And he says you can't anticipate it before you go there, as you cannot forget it once you have gone. And he says that the thing that happens in the story is that it's marvelous, but nothing in it is arbitrary. And he says that as you read it, and read it over and over and over, he says only years later, at a 10th or 20th reading, will the reader begin to realize what deft scholarship and profound reflection have gone to make everything in it so ripe, so friendly, and its own way so true. True. So it is a myth, it is a fantasy, but it is true. And for Lewis and Tolkien, truth is intimately connected with beauty, goodness, and joy. So that is part and parcel of what's going on. So these Andrew Lang lectures, which we mentioned, if you haven't read on fairy stories, please, after you finish Mythopoeia, please read this. It is just fire again. And Tolkien talks about the fairy story as something which uses fairy, whether it be for satire, adventure, morality, fantasy. He talks about the perilous realm, the adventures of men on quests in the perilous realm, and that the atmosphere of these is what really counts. And so he talks about the use of fairy stories, and he says they are not primarily or specifically appropriate for children. And he says that the four gifts that they offer, which we've talked about a little bit already today, he says that these gifts are far more necessary for adults than they are for children. That being fantasy, recovery, escape, and consolation. And fantasy is basically the sub-creation of a beautiful world that has that gorgeous inner consistency of reality, that you feel like you're discovering something and stepping into something that's been for a long time, but you just didn't know about it, like walking into a new country. And then he talks about recovery. And we could spend a long time talking about recovery. It's this whole idea of being shaken awake, to see clearly realities that are obscured by familiarity, being shown or told a truer story than the world is telling about itself. And Tolkien says that these stories can renew or recover something that we might have seen or thought we knew, but whose wonder we've lost, and that they can impart truth, beauty, and goodness untainted in a way that reality fails to do. He put it this way: we must clean our windows so that the things seen clearly may be freed from the drab blur of triteness and familiarity. It was in fairy stories I first divined the potency of words, the wonder of things such as stone and wood and iron, tree and grass, house and fire, bread and wine. And then he talks about escape, and he says, people say, oh, fairy stories are escapist. And he's like, that's great. What person locked in a jail wouldn't escape if he or she wanted to be able to do so? And he says, our modern progressive world imprisons us, and we need to be able to escape, and these stories provide us the hatch for doing that. And then consolation, and this is where eucatastrophe comes in. You could define eucatastrophe as a massive turn in fortune, something that seems unconquerable, a situation that's just going completely wrong, turning into unforeseen victory, brought by grace rather than by heroic effort. And it is catastrophic in the sense of its breadth, surprise, but positive in that a great evil or a misfortune is averted. And so this turning moment must create joy and a lifting of the heart and satisfaction. For Tolkien, this joy is intimately connected with the glimpse of underlying truth. And we see this in The Lord of the Rings. And I'm going to do something very dangerous in a slot right after lunch. I'm going to ask you to close your eyes and just listen as I read. There are many glorious scenes of eucatastrophe in The Lord of the Rings, but I just want to read two of them. They're a little bit long. Try to stay awake, but they are glorious. So if you'll just close your eyes and listen, this is from chapter 6 in The Return of the King, the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. It was even as the day thus began to turn against Gondor, and their hope wavered, that a new cry went up in the city, it being then mid-morning and a great wind blowing and the rain flying north and the sun shining. In that clear air, watchmen on the wall saw afar a new sight of fear, and their last hope left them. For Anduin from the bend at the Harlon so flowed that from the city men could look down it lengthwise for some leagues, and the farsighted could see any ships that approached, and looking thither they cried in dismay, for black against the glittering stream they beheld a fleet borne up on the wind, dromons and ships of great draught with many oars, and with black sails bellying up in the breeze. The corsairs of Umbar, the men shouted, the corsairs of Umbar. Look, the corsairs of Umbar are coming. So Belfalas is taken, and the Ether and Lebanon is gone. The corsairs are upon us. It is the last stroke of doom. And some without order, for none could be found to command them in the city, ran to the bells and told the alarm. And some blew the trumpets, sounding the retreat. Back to the walls, they cried, back to the walls. Come back to the city before all are overwhelmed. But the wind that sped the ships blew all their clamor away. The Rohirrim indeed had no need of news or alarm. All too well, they could see for themselves the black sails. For Éomer was now scarcely a mile from the Harlond, and a great press of his first foes was between him and the haven there, while new foes came swirling behind, cutting him off from the prince. Now he looked at the river, and hope died in his heart. And the wind that he had blessed he now called accursed. But the host of Mordor were enheartened and filled with a new lust and fury. They came yelling to the onset. Stern now was Éomer's mood, and his mind clear again. Helot blew the horns to rally all men to his banner that could come thither. For he thought to make a great shield wall at the last, and stand and fight there on foot till all fell, and to do deeds of song on the fields of Pelennor, though no man should be left in the west to remember the last king of the mark. So he rode to a green hillock, and there set his banner, and the white horse ran rippling in the wind. Out of doubt, out of dark, to the day's rising, I came singing in the sun, sword unsheathing. To hope's end I rode, and to heart's breaking. Now for wrath, now for ruin, and a red nightfall. These staves he spoke, and yet he laughed as he said them. For once more lust of battle was on him, and he was still unscathed, and he was young, and he was king, the lord of a fell people. And lo, even as he laughed at despair, he looked out again on the black ships, and he lifted up his sword to defy them. And then wonder took him and a great joy, and he cast his sword up in the sunlight and sang as he caught it. And all eyes followed his gaze, and behold, upon the foremost ship a great standard broke, and the wind displayed it as she turned toward the Harlond. There flowered a white tree, and that was for Gondor, but 7 stars were about it, and a high crown above it, the signs of Elendil, that no lord had borne for years beyond count. And the stars flamed in the sunlight, for they were wrought of gems by Arwen, daughter of Elrond. And the crown was bright in the morning, for it was wrought of mithril and gold. Thus came Aragorn, son of Arathorn, Elisar, Isildur's heir, out of the paths of the dead, borne upon a wind from the sea to the kingdom of Gondor. And the mirth of the Rohirrim was a torrent of laughter and a flashing of swords. And the joy and wonder of the city was a music of trumpets and a ringing of bells. But the host of Mordor were seized with bewilderment, and a great wizardry it seemed to them that their own ships should be filled with their foes. And a black dread fell on them, knowing that the tides of fate had turned against them and that their doom was at hand. Can open your eyes. It's just so good. It's one of those things where, as we used to have an associate would say, if that doesn't light your fire, your wood is wet. And I think part of what is so glorious here is Tolkien says 2 different times, all hope died. All hope died. And all of the odds are against him. There's no way that this can work out, and yet it does. And then there's this other example that you can keep your eyes open for this. I'm not going to read the whole thing because we'll run out of time. But this is in the Return of the King, Book 6, Chapter 4. And Sam and Frodo have been brought back by Gandalf and the eagles and are in the houses of healing. When Sam awoke, he found that he was lying on some soft bed, but over him gently swayed wide beechen boughs, and through their young leaves sunlight glimmered green and gold. All the air was full of sweet mingled scent. He remembered that smell, the fragrance of Ithilien. Bless me, he mused, how long have I been asleep? For the scent had borne him back to the day when he had lit his little fire under the sunny bank. And for the moment, all else between was out of waking memory. He stretched and drew a deep breath. Why, what a dream I've had, he muttered. I'm glad to wake. He sat up, and then he saw that Frodo was lying beside him and slept peacefully, one hand behind his head and the other resting upon the coverlet. It was the right hand, and the third finger was missing. Full memory flooded back, and Sam cried aloud, "It wasn't a dream! Then where are we?" And a voice spoke softly behind him, "In the land of Ithilien, in the keeping of the king, and he awaits you." With that, Gandalf stood before him, robed in white, his beard now gleaming like pure snow in the twinkling of the leafy sunlight. "Well, Master Samwise, how do you feel?" he said. But Sam lay back and stared with open mouth, and for a moment, between bewilderment and great joy, he could not answer. At last he gasped, "Gandalf, I thought you were dead. But then I thought I was dead myself. Is everything sad going to come untrue? What's happened to the world?" "A great shadow has departed," said Gandalf, and then he laughed. And the sound was like music or like water in a parched land. And as he listened, the thought came to Sam that he had not heard laughter, the pure sound of merriment, for days upon days without count. It fell upon his ears like the echo of all the joys he had ever known. But he himself burst into tears. Then as the sweet rain will pass down a wind of spring, and the sun will shine out the clearer, his tears ceased and his laughter welled up, and laughing, he sprang from his bed. And again, although we can't read all of the rest of it, there's this huge, great joy that is just bursting out because of how hopeless and terrible the situation had been. And in the midst of that, and in the midst of remembering it, all these impossible things suddenly happen. Sam thinks Gandalf is dead. The last he saw was, "You shall not pass," and then into the abyss with the Balrog. But instead, now Gandalf is standing before him, and Sam thinks maybe he's died, maybe he's in heaven. But then he realizes that he's not dead, and he has that great line, "Is everything sad going to come untrue?" And part of what's glorious in this next part is this little note from Tom Shippey about what Tolkien is up to here. Tom Shippey is really good about pointing out what Tolkien's up to that may not be immediately obvious. And so there's this whole weird little passage right at the end of this talking about March 25th. And you think, why is he making such a big deal about this date? But of course, the 25th of March, if any self-respecting medievalist will tell you, is the day of the crucifixion. For centuries, the church understood that as the date of the crucifixion. And then Tolkien goes on in his somewhat belabored Appendix B to talk about December 25th. Oh, what's that? December 25th? Does that ring any bells? December 25th is the day the Fellowship set out from Rivendell. So the whole action of The Lord of the Rings takes place then in the mythic space between Christmas, Christ's birth, and the crucifixion, Christ's death. So there are multiple things to be learned from this. And one of the beautiful things there, Frederick Buechner, who some of you all may have read some of his work, Buechner has a great book called The Remarkable Ordinary, How to Stop, Look, and Listen to Life, where I feel like he's really channeling Tolkien in so much of this. And he comments on the fact that so many transformational moments are not miracles, but they're found in attention to the details, the anticipation of the predictable, and astonished reflection on the ordinary. And Buechner quotes from Tolkien, and he says, one of the things we must listen for is joy. It's hard to talk about joy for the almost superstitious reason that you might take the bloom off it. You'll quit, you'll threaten it, you'll fear it will come to an end when the demons come and gobble it up. But almost in spite of ourselves, we get glimpses of joy, and maybe glimpses are all we ever have of joy. There's a wonderful phrase of Tolkien's in an essay he wrote on fairy tales, where he speaks of joy beyond the walls of the world, poignant as grief, which you glimpse in fairy tales during what he calls the sudden joyous turn, where the frog turns out to be a prince, where the straw is spun into gold, or the funny little man turns out to be the king. The sudden glimpse of joy beyond the walls of the world. And that is such an important thing for us to remember as we consider Tolkien, that one of his gifts is to help open that up for all of us. Someone earlier today mentioned Holly Ordway's books. I would so commend them to you. They are just wonderful, scholarly, and fun to read. But she talks about how when she was an atheist, reading on fairy stories sort of stuck with her. And when she was reading this essay, Tolkien used this word evangelium, and she didn't understand that word. And she goes on to say, joy beyond the walls of the world is a profound, intriguing image. Why did this stick with me even when I fully embraced atheism a few years later? For one thing, it's one of the most powerful pieces of writing I've ever read, that is, on fairy stories. But it also stuck with me because of the way Tolkien was both passionate and matter-of-fact at the same time. He wasn't shoving a Bible lesson into an essay on a different topic. He wasn't preaching at me. He was simply unfolding naturally what fantasy might mean in the larger sense, what it might point to in reality. A devout Catholic, he wasn't trying to showcase his piety for Christian readers or argue with potential atheist readers. An academic at a secular university, a world-renowned expert in his field, he had no reason to bring in the incarnation, the resurrection, the Gloria, except that he knew that it was all true, and knew it so thoroughly and deeply that he was unself-conscious about saying so when it was relevant to his argument in his essay. Though at the time I didn't really understand what he says, much less believe or accept it, Tolkien's word nevertheless made a shiver go up my spine. Here was an expression of the haunting, convicting beauty that I experienced in reading Lord of the Rings. Here was Tolkien saying there was a reason I was so moved by stories like his books and Lewis's Narnia Chronicles. It stuck with me, even at a time I was convinced that God did not exist, and I would stuff out like a candle flame at death. So just wrapping up from Tolkien's epilogue on fairy stories, the joy which I've selected as the mark of the true fairy story merits more consideration. And jumping down, the question is it true? The answer to that question I gave at first was, if you built your little world well, yes, it's true for that world. That's enough for the artist. But in the eucatastrophe, we see a brief vision that the answer may be greater and may be a far-off gleam or echo of evangelium in the real world. I'd venture to say that in approaching the Christian story from this direction, it has long been my feeling, a joyous feeling, that the Gospels contain a fairy story, or a story of a larger kind which embraces all the essence of fairy stories. They contain many marvels, peculiarly artistic, beautiful and moving, mythical in their perfect self-contained significance, and among the marvels is the most complete and greatest conceivable eucatastrophe. But this story has entered history and the primary world. The desire and aspiration of subcreation has been raised to the fulfillment of creation. The birth of Christ is the eucatastrophe of man's history. The resurrection is the eucatastrophe of the story of the incarnation. The story begins and ends in joy. And as preeminently the inner consistency of reality, there's no tale ever told that men would rather find was true. For the art of it has the supremely convincing tone of primary art, that is, of creation. It's not difficult to imagine the peculiar excitement and joy one would feel if any specially beautiful fairy story were found to be primarily true, its narrative to be history, without thereby necessarily losing the mythical or allegorical significance it possessed. The joy would have exactly the same quality, if not the same degree, as the joy which the turn in a fairy story gives. Such joy has the very taste of primary truth. Otherwise, its name would not be joy. It looks forward or backward to the great eucatastrophe. The Christian joy, the Gloria, is of the same kind, but it preeminently, infinitely, if our capacity were not finite, high and joyous. But this story is supreme, and it is true. Art has been verified. God is the Lord of angels and of men and of elves. Legend and history have met and fused. The Evangelium has not abrogated legends, it has hallowed them. The Christian joy, the Gloria, is of the same kind. The story is supreme, and it is true. Thank you.